Some choices whisper, so softly, you don't even know they're shaping you. Not the big ones, not the surgeries, the signatures, the moves, the final calls, but the small ones. The ones you make between sighs, between sips, between the pause before you get up or stay seated. After 70, nothing shouts anymore, not even the body. It just waits for you to notice. And in that waiting, there are habits, not rules, not resolutions, just quiet rituals that choose for you, day by day, whether you're softening toward life or slowly turning away from it. This isn't about fixing or even changing. It's about listening to the movements that carry you toward strength or toward stillness you didn't choose. Let's walk into them, softly. 1. The way you stand up tells a story. Frank used to spring up from his chair, as if motion owed him nothing. Now, he leans forward, plants his palms on his thighs, and pauses. Not out of pain, but preparation. He doesn't rush it anymore, because he's learned that how you rise reveals more than how fast you walk. It's not about strength, not really. It's about connection, between body and will, between the quiet muscles that keep you vertical and the even quieter voice inside that says, I'm still willing to rise. One morning, as he watched his shadow lengthen across the floor, he realized he'd never paid attention to the miracle of standing. But now, each time he did, he could feel the conversation happening inside his hips, the tension in his thighs answering back like old friends, the gentle roll of his ankles remembering balance. He used to think decline was inevitable, but then his doctor said something simple. Use it like a ritual. When you stand up, feel it fully. And so he did. He began placing one hand lightly over his leg before he rose, like a promise, a thank you, a check-in. And something changed. He wasn't just standing up. He was returning to his body with intention. Science would say that habit activates stabilizers, trains hip extension, preserves independence. Frank just says, it reminds me I'm not done. Every time he rises, he does it with presence, no longer trying to be quick, just whole. He stands not like a man avoiding the floor, but like one choosing to meet the day. 2. The foods you forgive can quietly turn against you. Elaine always said her comfort food was a warm bowl of noodles, buttery, soft, the kind that hugged you from the inside out. She'd made them for years, Tuesday lunch, rainy Saturdays. Even when her appetite faded, that bowl always called her back. But then her legs began to swell, slowly, a little more each week. She thought it was the weather, or age, or just too much sitting. Until one day, after a bowl too rich, she couldn't slip her foot into her shoe. The doctor didn't scold her. He simply asked, do you feel lighter or heavier after you eat? And she realized she didn't know. She had stopped listening. It was never about guilt, never about rules. It was about noticing. The foods she once forgave, for their salt, their sugar, their weight, were no longer forgiving her body in return. So, she made a quiet change, not a diet, not a purge. She just began to pause after she ate. She'd sit still, one hand on her belly, eyes closed. How do I feel now? Not in judgment, in conversation. The answers came not in words, but in ease or discomfort, in clarity or fog, in a heartbeat that moved calmly or pushed too hard. Science calls it postprandial inflammation, a body's response to what doesn't nourish anymore. Elaine just called it learning to listen to food like it had something to say. And over time, she swapped her noodles for something simpler, still warm, still soft, but lighter. She didn't miss the old bowl because she gained something else, a body that no longer felt betrayed after every meal. And now, after every bite, she waits. Not for symptoms, but for truth. 3. The people you sit with decide how you rise. Walter's mornings were always quiet. A chair, a mug, a newspaper folded more out of habit than interest. No alarm, no one waiting on him, no plans to rush toward. Some might call it peace. He called it routine. But if he were honest, he'd admit the silence didn't feel chosen. It just arrived after his wife passed, after his friends stopped driving at night, after his daughter moved 2 time zones away. He never complained. Loneliness, after all, wasn't something men his age spoke about. You just swallowed it with your morning tea. But one Tuesday, a neighbor, much younger, a bit too talkative, asked if he could sit for a few minutes. Walter shrugged. Suit yourself. But something shifted. The tea didn't feel so warm, but the air did. The silence didn't stretch so far. They talked about small things, birds, garbage pickup, the price of apples. And when the neighbor left, Walter stayed seated a little longer. But it wasn't out of emptiness. It was digestion, of company, of remembering, of being remembered. That night, he didn't sleep better, but he dreamt clearer, and in the morning, his steps were steadier. Science has words for this: oxytocin, cortisol regulation, cognitive resilience. But Walter didn't care for studies. He just knew that when he sat with someone, he rose lighter. So he made it a ritual. Every Sunday, he'd make a second cup of tea, even if no one came. He left the chair across empty, but with intention. Sometimes the neighbors showed up. Sometimes a bird landed on the windowsill. Either way, he wasn't alone. And somehow, that changed everything. Because it turns out, who you sit beside seeps into the muscles you use to rise. 4. What you repeat in silence becomes the shape of your mind. Lorraine didn't shout anymore. Not at others, not even at herself. But her mind, it murmured, a steady stream of second guessing. Why did I forget that? Of course I dropped it again. Typical, you always mess things up. Soft, like background static, but always on. She didn't realize it at first. The words had lived in her so long they stopped sounding like language. They just felt like truth. Until one morning, as she fumbled with her buttons, her granddaughter, age 8, tilted her head and said, "Grandma, why are you so mean to you?" It caught her, right in the ribs. She had no answer. She just stood there, hands frozen on cotton, heart suddenly aware of the weight she'd been carrying, not in her arms, but in her thoughts. That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened, really listened, to the voice in her head. And for the first time, she heard how tired it sounded. Not angry, just lonely. So she made a change, a tiny one. Every morning, after brushing her teeth, she looked at herself, not for flaws, but for presence. And she said one thing, one small sentence that didn't hurt. Some days it was, "You're doing okay." Other days, "Let's try again." Once it was just, "I see you." She didn't believe it at first, but her nervous system did. Her posture softened, her breath slowed, something unclenched. Neuroscientists call it rewiring self-perception. Lorraine just called it being kinder. Not loud kindness, not performative. Just gentle words spoken into the quiet before the world spoke back. And now, her inner voice still visits her. But it comes with open hands. It sits beside her, not above her. Because what we whisper to ourselves builds the rooms we live in. 5. How you end your day is how you start again. Louis used to collapse into sleep. Shoes still by the bed, TV still humming, heart still sprinting from a day that never slowed. He thought that was rest, that fatigue meant he'd earned it. But every morning, he woke tired, fogged, already behind. Until one night, he paused. Just 10 seconds before switching off the lamp. And he heard it, his own breath, shallow and unfamiliar, as if he'd been holding it for decades. He didn't change everything. He just began noticing how he ended things. The way he folded his socks, the way he rinsed his plate, the way he said goodnight to no one, but still meant it. He placed a chair near the window and sat for 2 minutes each night, watching the trees settle. He called it unwrapping the day. And somehow, sleep came softer, not as escape, but as a return. Louis didn't know much about the nervous system, but he knew this. When he ended his day with a whisper, the morning didn't scream. Science says that how we transition affects the quality of our rest. That calm before bed deepens the brain's repair. Louis just knew that his dreams changed. Less chaos, more memory, more light. So he made a ritual, dim the light, touch the doorknob, thank the day, even the hard parts. And when he slid into bed, he let the silence wrap him like a blanket passed down. Not for warmth, but for belonging. He no longer rushed into rest. He entered it like a room prepared just for him. And in the morning, his feet found the floor not with dread, but with grace. Because the way you close a chapter writes the first word of the next one. We don't remember the exact day it started getting harder to bend, or when names began slipping before we could catch them, or when laughter became something we mostly remembered rather than heard. That's the grief no one prepares us for, the kind that doesn't come in funerals or farewells, but in subtle vanishings. A favorite cafe that closed, a letter that never got written, a walk we meant to take and never did. These are not tragedies, they're just unnoticed endings. Time doesn't always leave with ceremony. Sometimes it exits quietly, through the cracks between our routines. And suddenly, we're standing in a life we don't quite recognize, surrounded by familiar things that feel slightly too far away. Walter once opened a drawer and found a birthday card he meant to send 7 years ago. He sat with it in his lap, not ashamed, not regretful, just still. And then he did something he hadn't done in a while. He laughed. Because there, in his own handwriting, was the version of him who still believed in small gestures. That version wasn't lost, just quiet, just waiting. So, he lit a candle, placed the card beside it, not to send, but to honor, a little altar for all the moments he lived without noticing. That's the kind of grief we carry at this age, not sorrow for what happened, but for what slipped past while we were too busy surviving. But even that grief can become sacred when we hold it gently. Not to change it, not to undo it, just to say, I saw you eventually. And in that seeing, we return to ourselves. For a long time, Mira thought she was late. Late to stretch, late to change, late to understand her body, her grief, her need for company. Every article told her what she should have done in her 50s. Every friend seemed to have already figured it out. She felt like she was catching up to a version of herself that everyone else had already met. But then, one evening, after walking without music, just listening to her own breath against the sound of leaves, she stopped, not because something hurt, but because something didn't. She stood there, hand on her chest, and thought, I'm not behind. I'm just arriving on my own clock. And that changed everything. She didn't need to rush anymore. Didn't need to apologize for not knowing sooner. Didn't need to prove she was still with it. Because she was. Just in a different rhythm. One that matched her season. Her marrow. Her pace. There was no finish line. No final bell. Only this moment. And the quiet recognition that arriving isn't always about being first. It's about being here, fully. Science might call it chronological versus biological age, the soft reset of self-acceptance. But Mira just calls it being done with the race she never wanted to run. Now she wakes without guilt, listens without preparing her reply, moves like time isn't leaving her behind, but walking with her. And in that space, there's a calmness no milestone ever gave her. She doesn't need to win anymore. She just needs to witness. Because the life she thought she missed is still unfolding. One slow petal at a time. If you've made it this far, not in the script, but in life, you've already chosen strength, not the kind they write about, not the one that lifts or wins or finishes, but the kind that lingers, listens, returns, quietly, softly, daily. We were never told how much gentleness it takes to stay, to wake up in the same body that aches but still moves, to open the same cupboard and make the same tea for a heart that still learns how to hope. This isn't about habits. It never was. It's about what happens when you realize you're still becoming, even now, especially now. Because growth after 70 isn't louder, it's deeper, like a root that keeps spreading underground, unseen, but holding you steady through every season. And maybe that's the real arrival, not reaching something new, but seeing where you are as enough to begin again. If this script felt like a mirror, then good. If it felt like a hand reaching for yours, even better. But more than anything, let it feel like your own breath finally sitting down beside you. Not to ask for anything, not to push, just to stay with you. You don't need to change fast. You don't need to change everything. You only need to notice what's still kind inside you. And if that noticing becomes a ritual, we'll be here, not in front, not behind, beside you, as always, as ever, as softly as you need.